Are late 90s, early 2000s BMWs reliable? Well, the simple answer is yes and no. Now, with that said, my answer to this question is based off my own experience of driving an E39 528i and looking at various other forums. So, if you are looking to purchase an older BMW, I would recommend getting one with an inline 6 because I think you're probably going to have the least headaches. You see, the inline 6 engine itself is pretty bulletproof. In fact, I've heard stories that some are still running from the 90s at 500,000 kilometers with basic maintenance, and they're doing just fine. However, it's everything else outside the engine that seems to fail. And that's why BMWs tend to get a bad reputation with reliability. Now, why is that all those other components fail? Well, in order to cut costs, BMW usually looks towards other manufacturers to produce those parts to save costs. And chances are those parts might not meet the standard of quality that BMW has. But nevertheless, let's take a look at a few generic problems that one can encounter. The most common problem by far is the cooling systems and steering systems in these BMWs. Firstly, what you want to make sure is that any hoses aren't ruptured or there's any leaks. And you also want to make sure that all the clamps are secured and not broken. These clamps and hoses are important as they make sure that coolant does not leave the system, the cooling system itself. If coolant is leaving the system, the engine can overheat, and that can cause serious damage to the cylinder heads, the head gasket, and the engine block. Moving on, there's a lot of plastic bits that are in the cooling system and unfortunately crack due to heat. One of them is the expansion tank, and this holds the coolant, and again, you want to make sure you can preserve your coolant. Another piece to consider is the radiator. The radiator itself is, well, at least the outside is made out of plastic, and it also cracks due to heat, especially the plastic junction where hoses themselves feed coolant into the radiator. Again, those are usually common places of the coolant system failing. There's also two more crucial components you should consider. One is the water pump. The only real telltale sign for it being broken is if the car is overheating or it's leaking coolant. If you are looking at a used BMW, make sure you check the service history and see whether or not the water pump has been changed. If there's no sign, you should probably change it, as these do tend to fail at roughly 150,000 kilometers, and when you are changing it, I recommend going with a metal one rather than a plastic OEM part, as the metal one is more resistant to heat. The thermostat is also prone to failure as well. This part sits right above the water pump, and what it does is it regulates coolant coming into the engine depending on engine temperature. Now, BMW has designed it so that it does fail open, meaning that if it breaks down, coolant will be fed into the engine constantly. If it were to fail closed, that means that no coolant would be fed into the engine, resulting in overheating. To know whether or not the thermostat has failed, what you want to do is you want to start the car from a cold start, and it usually takes about 5 to 7 minutes, normally with a working thermostat, for the car to come up to operating temperature. And what I mean by the car heating up to operating temperature is when the temperature gauge needle is sitting right at the middle. With a failed thermostat, it's probably going to take about 20 or so minutes because coolant will be fed into the engine right from the cold start. So all in all, if the car has over 130,000 kilometers, make sure you check the service history and see whether or not all these components have been replaced. And if you're looking at a car for the first time, make sure there's no deterioration, as again, failure of the cooling system can lead to serious engine failure. Apart from that, if you're looking at a BMW V8, make sure these components are replaced earlier, because the V8s do tend to produce more heat. Another thing to watch out for is BMW's Vanos system. This essentially controls when the valves in the cylinders open, giving you maximum performance when you need it and fuel economy when you don't. Essentially like VTEC and Hondas. Signs can be anywhere from worse fuel economy to rough idles, and prolonging it could lead to serious engine damage. So the vanos can sometimes be quite a nightmare. Things that can fail within the vanos are seals, solenoids, and gears. Again, if possible, check the service history for this. The seals themselves are especially a problem if in the M52 engine with the technical update. As for suspension, it's usual wear like any other car. Springs, dampers, control arms, etc. can only last so long before they need to be replaced. The bushings on the control arms are a common problem for Beamers of this era, and loose steering is a usual sign of that. Also, if a BMW of this era has self-leveling suspension or air suspension, those are prone to fail, and check the service records because it is expensive to fix. If you're wondering about transmissions, BMW used Getrag, ZF, and GM transmissions in this era. Transmissions are generally hit or miss with BMWs, but if you're looking to save costs, a BMW with a manual transmission will most likely have a longer lasting transmission and cheaper running costs to complement it compared to an automatic. As for the X5, check to see whether the transfer case or drive shaft have been replaced in the service history. A failed transfer case or drive shaft can occur in a higher mileage SUV, not just BMWs. And finally, the interior. It really depends with the interior on how the car was treated. With aggressive use, of course, things will break, but if it is treated properly with care, things will hold up for quite a while. But nevertheless, here are a few common issues. Firstly is the seals around the doors and the windows. These are prone to crack if the car has been sitting for a good portion of its life, and it's also a good indicator of whether or not the car is garage kept. Another thing to consider is the regulators for the front and rear windows. These tend to fail at higher mileage, so try to keep your windows free of debris as they can affect the regulators. The vapor barrier in the rear doors can also fail due to the bad adhesive. The telltale sign of it is water accumulating in the footwells of the rear passengers. And finally, an issue that every BMW has is fading cluster pixels. There's nothing you can do about them, they're just eventually going to fail at higher mileage. So there you go, these are some common issues that can occur with BMWs of this era. Now keep in mind that you're probably going to have the most problems with the 7 Series as they tend to be the most complicated in terms of engineering, especially the E65. In fact, just stay away from the E65 as they tend to have electrical issues that can amount to more than the car is worth. Now there's a lot of things that I left out because in the end anything can fail on a car. I simply chose to look at more common important failures. So are BMWs from the late 90s, early 2000s reliable? Well, in my opinion, if you get a straight 6 that's well cared for, I think you should be okay. In fact, I myself drive a straight 6 that's in good condition, and I've had a pretty positive experience with maintenance so far. Apart from fluids, filters, brakes, and tires, it hasn't been very expensive, to be honest. There have been, in the past 5 years, 2 major things that have happened, and compared to other BMW owners, those things aren't major at all. And the first thing is the camshaft position sensor. Now, oxygen sensors in BMWs tend to fail all the time at higher mileage. The camshaft position sensor in particular is in an awkward spot. I think the whole job at the dealership costs about $600 to replace. And the reason is because it's actually a labor-intensive job. They take out the whole engine, replace the sensor, and then put it back in because the sensor itself is in an awkward place. The sensor itself only costs about $50 OAM, or less. My father and I chose to do it instead of taking it to the dealership. It was really awkward putting that sensor in because it's in such a tight spot, and if you have small hands, that really helps. But we eventually got the job done. I think it took us about 3 hours or so of fiddling around in there, and I think we saved, maybe $400. Another issue was a plastic part that connects a coolant hose into the engine. Now, I saw some coolant residue on there, and I knew a mechanic at the time, and I asked him if he could take a look at it, and he said the best thing to do was to replace that piece. The piece itself I bought at the BMW dealership, and I think that costed about $50. I think it might be called the upper water elbow, I'm not too sure. But anyways, the labor itself took maybe half an hour at most, and on top of that I got a free coolant flush, I guess you could say. So in the end, it is true that BMWs do have more expensive parts and the labor costs more compared to other cars. However, BMW has one of the best communities on the internet, with forums and YouTube videos and whatnot. You can find instructions on virtually how to fix anything that can go wrong, and also sources for cheaper parts. So in the end, make sure all the fluids and filters are changed in the appropriate intervals, and as the saying goes, if you take care of your car, it will take care of you. Thanks for watching.